For the month of June, we're going through our Juneteenth Commonwealth Conversation series. Juneteenth, past, present, and future. Joining us today is Andre Taylor, or historian from William & Mary. It's Stay the Water. I'm your host, Dr. Claville. We'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back. It's Stay the Water. I'm your host, Dr. Eric Claville. I want to thank you, as always, for joining us on this beautiful Sunday as we broadcast from the campus of the Norfolk State University here in the great city of Norfolk, Virginia, Hampton Roads. From Hot 91, the soul of VA. Listen, I'm excited today because we are broadcasting from our brand new studio here on campus. It's been a while in the works, and it is a phenomenal setting. So we're excited that not only the university is moving forward under our great leadership of Dr. J, but our phenomenal radio station, WNSB Hot 91, the soul of VA, along with Stay the Water. So we're excited to have you with us as always, and we've got a phenomenal conversation as we continue to talk about Juneteenth. But first, I want to thank our producer, Marvin Folks, also known as DJ Scandalous, which you can hear live here on Hot 91 every Monday through Friday from 2 to 6 p.m. And listen, we couldn't do this without you. And that's the listeners, the Spartan Nation, some of the greatest alumni in the world that support us here, and also all of you that are joining us over our app, that are listening to us across the country and across the world. So listen, if you enjoy the show, continue to tune in, continue to give your likes on it, on our Facebook page, on all of our social media, and call the station and let us know how we're doing. Tell us that you love the show and all that we do, because your voice matters. And that's why we do what we do. So for the entire month of June, we're continuing our Commonwealth Conversation series focusing on Juneteenth. You know, Marvin, Juneteenth is a holiday. Well, it's actually a day. Let me take back a holiday. It's a day that is not only important for African Americans, but important for the world. This country is of course, we're kind of behind on a lot of things when it comes to recognizing our past and making sure it's included in the future and in the present. And Juneteenth is one of those. But to help us bring it closer to home, I'm having phenomenal rock star guests in this area every single week. And this week is no different. We've got Andre Taylor, or historian from the College of William & Mary, here to join us to talk about Juneteenth, past, present, and future. Mr. Taylor, thank you so much for joining us here on Stay the Water.
Glad to be here. Thanks very much for having me.
Absolutely. Look, when I mentioned, everyone knows what a historian is. Of course, we're at a university. We have people that join us and they understand a little bit about history. But when we say oral historian, tell us, what is the difference between oral historian and just a regular historian?
So the difference between your traditional historian, that's going to be a person who focuses a lot of primary and secondary sources, a lot of documentation, artifacts, different types of things that are tangible. But when you interject the oral historian side of it, what you have is an individual or individuals who go out and interview people who may have been at a historical event, at a family event. And what you're doing is you're filling in the gaps that the traditional history misses out on. Because too often you focus on the primary and secondary sources while leaving out these living primary sources. So my job is to go out and get the stories from those individuals that help fill in the gaps and give a more intact, complete narrative.
Oral history is very important, especially for African American culture, because we get a lot of stories that's passed down through word of mouth, and not just us, but a lot of cultures. How important is it in African American culture that we have oral historians?
Extremely important. When you think about the transatlantic slave trade, we came here with this ability to maintain our stories. We had the griots of West Africa who were charged with maintaining family history, community history. So we're no different than those individuals. I like the term neo-griot, which is what we are today, as we continue to maintain our family histories and narratives by listening to Big Mama when she passes a story down or a recipe. And we have an obligation to continue in that realm of collecting oral histories within our families, because we know that in this country, too often, we're left out of the narrative.
Absolutely. Before we actually started the show, you and I, we talked about the importance of this holiday. And I call it a holiday because it's a holiday here in the Commonwealth of Virginia, but that's not the case. But Juneteenth, a lot of individuals, really we just starting getting to know what Juneteenth is, right? Now, growing up myself, I went to Juneteenth parades, and we had Juneteenth and all of that good stuff, and there are a lot of things that end up happening that we really don't understand, what Juneteenth really is. So from your perspective, can you tell us, what Juneteenth really means to us, what it means to you?
Two-pronged here. So for me, I can't necessarily say that it's actually the end of enslavement. We know that it's the day that Union troops arrived in Galveston Bay, Texas, and emancipated about 250,000 enslaved people, giving a message that the Emancipation Proclamation has given them their freedom. However, we know that enslavement took on different terms. We had sharecropping, we had domestic servants, domestic housekeepers, and so forth. So the actual act of enslavement that we know of by definition ended, but the lack of rights and freedoms for African Americans in this country did not actually come automatically. So to me, the Juneteenth represents the ending of one form of enslavement, the birth of another, and the continuation of the integration of the African American in this country.
And for our listeners, understand that when we talk about Juneteenth, we're talking about the effect of the Emancipation Proclamation, which came in 1863, January 1st, when President Abraham Lincoln actually signed it. But the last African Americans that were enslaved, even after the Civil War, actually heard and were emancipated through that doctrine, through that very important piece of law, 1865. So 2.5 years after it was signed, and 2.5 months after the Civil War. When Brother Taylor, when you hear those dates, that it took 2.5 years to actually get it into effect after the Civil War, and 2.5 months after the Civil War ended, what comes to mind to me is, delay in promise. How do you see that, especially as it relates to today and things that are promised to African Americans?
Well, my grandmother used the term squeezing blood out of a turnip. And I mean, when you look at those dates, they squeeze that last little bit of free labor out of our service. And I mean, you put it in context, it's 1865. There was no email. There were no text messages. So I get the lag and delay. And Texas is quite a distance from where a lot of the sites of the war took place. So I understand that there's a lag, but there had been a better way of communicating that. But I think that we don't know all of the logistics that happened. But it's disappointing, 2.5 years after the fact. And then, in some cases, longer than that, because in some parts of South Carolina, 1862, they were emancipated. Mm. So you have 3 years that you're looking at here versus the 2.5. I'd be upset, and we should be upset about that. And the fact of the matter is now we have this day, and what are we going to do with it? Yeah. You know, that's the big question now.
So let's move forward. So we know what Juneteenth was, how it was started. We understand the lack of its effect, right? So what does Juneteenth mean today?
Juneteenth today, that's a complicated question. I would say that today it's more of the commodification of it. We see that it's very commercialized now, but the commodity of benefiting off of African Americans once again has reared its ugly head. You have Walmart who rolled out an ice cream to celebrate Juneteenth. I study food history, and I understand that in 1865, yes, there was ice cream in America, but there was no red velvet ice cream. We were not the ones eating ice cream and celebrating that, you know, our brothers and sisters were emancipated. So I don't understand the correlation with that one. That makes absolutely no sense to me. And then you have the Children's Museum of Indianapolis with the watermelon salad for Juneteenth. You know, I understand that within the African diaspora, the watermelon is actually something that we brought here with us. It's very prevalent in our culture. However, what I'm not understanding is what was the purpose and intent. You know, you have organizations like the Association of African American Museums who could have gladly helped you partner with one of the African American museums in the country or historic sites to help you better interpret what Juneteenth means and have it in a celebration where you bring African Americans to the table to help guide the direction of how we're going to celebrate this. So I'm not pleased at all, but I'm also not surprised with the fact that we have these companies that are trying to benefit off of our labor and our skin.
Well, what would you say? Let me play devil's advocate here. What would you say about people that say, oh, you're just being too sensitive? You know, we commercialize everything. It's America. We commercialize Christmas. We commercialize, you know, Easter. We commercialize 4th of July, all these important dates in our country. And this is just one extra thing we're commercializing.
It's one extra day, but when you think about the more than 400 years of enslavement to get to this one point where we can say that there's a celebration of freedom, I think that there's a lot to take in there. And it's not just another day that we can commercialize. This is dealing with the ugliness, and we shouldn't sit here and dismiss the fact that this comes from hatred, from capitalism. There was a lot of dark history that happened within the time before Juneteenth and after Juneteenth. And this country continues to have its way where if you feel uncomfortable, you're not allowed, you know, to do that anymore. You can't talk about the past, you know, without making somebody uncomfortable. So I say give us this opportunity to share in our cultural heritage and understand that we lost hundreds of thousands of people during enslavement. And this isn't a moment to sit here and make ice cream and salads about. This is a time to sit down and talk. This is a moment. Juneteenth is a teachable moment for America.
It's Stay the Water. I'm your host, Dr. Eric Claville. You're joining us on this very beautiful Sunday here in Hampton Roads as we continue our Commonwealth Conversation series for the month of June. We're looking at Juneteenth, past, present, and future. For the entire month, we have experts and rock stars in the area of history that are telling us about the impact of Juneteenth, past, present, and future. Today, we have Andre Taylor, or historian from the College of William and Mary, that's here to talk to us more about the impact of Juneteenth now in the present. You know, when we were talking before the show, we talked about how Juneteenth is a holiday. But it's a holiday here in the Commonwealth of Virginia, but it's not a holiday across the country. Tell us where Juneteenth is celebrated and why you believe it's not celebrated all across the country.
Well, Juneteenth is only celebrated in 10 states, the Commonwealth of Virginia being one, Massachusetts, New Jersey, New York, Pennsylvania, Washington State, Oregon, and Delaware also join in celebration of it. That's not enough. Texas was the first to actually have it as a state holiday in 1980, and the others are more contemporary, with their dates being 2008, 2020, 2021. You know, it reminds me a lot of the Martin Luther King Day, when that became a federal holiday in 1986. States joined in, and then all of a sudden Arizona backed out and then rejoined in 1982 and celebrated Martin Luther King Day. But it took some time to get the momentum to actually have the day anyway in the first place. And I think that is going forward, unfortunately, I think what's really going to drive this is going to be the ability to capitalize off of the day. How much money can companies bring in with parades and other celebrations where people are going to be spending money on this holiday, and how do these cities and municipalities, how do they benefit from it? And that's my problem with the holiday. The holiday is always going to be in the background benefiting. Who benefits? How do we as African Americans benefit from having this? Because a lot of these companies, before Black Lives Matter came out, there was no push for anything. But now it's popular. And so now we're going back to the mid-1970s when it was popular to include African American history in our historic sites and museums. And you see a number of museums that came to be because of that. And I'm seeing that come around again now, where it's popular. It's the popular thing to do. And when it's something that's popular, the first thing that comes to mind is commodifying and capitalism.
I want to address this issue because we talk about, understanding, the impact of that time period on African Americans in our country's history. And a lot of that is not known. Look, growing up, when I was taught history in K through 12, we had this history book that was maybe 500 pages when you get to high school long, and about 5 pages was dedicated to African Americans, right? You had one page, maybe a paragraph about slavery. Then you had Frederick Douglass and the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln, then Martin Luther King, and that was pretty much it. And then as things progressed, we got a little bit about current African American history and Black History Month. And you have this now. You have this clash of what I call the miseducation of critical race theory, right? So now you have individuals who are saying, no, we don't want our kids taught this because it's indoctrination. But in actuality, it's history. So I want you to kind of talk through with us, how do we teach this important part of our nation's and people's history when on this other end, we've got this clash that's coming from every angle of miseducation of CRT?
Well, we have to first understand that the people who are raising the most noise have turned in their sheets and hoods for business suits. So it's going to take a lot more to address them to understand that their past is directly correlated with ours. Wow. I have 2 daughters. They're both twin girls that are 6. And I at first struggled with how I was going to educate them about their history. And before I knew it, they were asking questions about George Washington. And I'll never forget, one of them said, George Washington had fake teeth, didn't he? And I wanted to jump at the opportunity to say they were not fake teeth. They were the teeth of real humans that were extracted from their mouths. And you realize that you can't do that with children that young. You want to, but you can't.
Right.
And I think that the integration of African American history into American history, because they're synonymous, we have to be able to tell them collectively. I had a conversation with my wife recently where I said, I'm sick and tired that we have to have our separate museums because we're not really included into the mainstream American history museums. There is a purpose that we have our own museums, and it's to tell our side of the story, but we don't have the funding a lot of times in those museums, or we're we're put in a situation where we still have to go to the larger museum for help, and then the trade-offs could be where we're lessening what's being taught in these museums through exhibits and educational programs. But when it comes to K through 12, the biggest problem we have are politicians. We have politicians who say that if you feel uncomfortable with the way that history is being taught, here's a hotline that you can send a message into. And what that does is that keeps the narrative clean. That keeps the narrative as, George Washington and a cherry tree. Well, that's also probably, myth. So we have to be careful with what information we give out, because the rest of the world has the receipt of what happened in early America. And it's a shame that those repositories are overseas, but now with things being digitized, we have access to see who was taken from where people stopped, and a lot of foreign countries, especially in the islands, are now starting to use their history when it came to enslavement and in the Middle Passage. They're using these as teaching tools to people who are coming on vacation. So you're going away and coming back to your country saying, okay, I need more answers to this. So you're creating this distrust when you have tourists come back after seeing some of the sites that they've seen on these tours. They're coming back with questions, and we have politicians that continue to sweep things under the rug, and it's only going to just add to this frustration.
The saying is all politics is local, and I always say, there are three things an elected official has to do. Number one, get elected. Number two, get reelected. And number three, stay elected. And with that, they kind of push for the will of the people and what the people want. So if the people that are making the most noise don't want their children learning this important part of our history, which is a pretty bad part for a large part of our country history, how do we influence that? How do we change that narrative to say, hey, history's not clean, history's a little dirty, but it's our story?
It's going to take people like myself. It's going to take museum curators. It's going to take parents. I think now we need parents more than ever to be vocal. We need educators to be vocal. We can't have it where educators are afraid of saying things that may not be popular to their school districts, but we have to have them join in with us. And like I said, everybody's first educators were their parents, and we need to continue in that ilk. We need to move back to that. We need that communication with parents and teachers together, because that's the force that's going to move things. And some of the parents are going to be against teaching things, and it comes back to the whole concept of my heritage. In the Commonwealth of Virginia, and there's not many places you can go where you're not looking at Confederate flags still flying high on 64 or 95. So they're very entrenched in this concept of my heritage is being attacked. Well, our heritage was never addressed. We were never the ones in the forefront. And it bothers me that we have individuals who can say things like, I'm an American, but you still have your Confederate battle flag flying in front of your home, failing to realize that they came in second place in the war. So once we get those individuals to realize that the stories they've heard from mom and pa may not be all the way true, that's another fight we're going to have to straighten things out, because those people are screaming louder, and they're in those areas. They're constituents of the individuals that are being elected that are pushing for these same laws to silence the teaching of our history.
Education is the key. We've got one of our faithful listeners, Lady KG Real Estate Realtor, Katrina Griggs from Berkshire Hathaway. She said, wow, I didn't know that about George Washington's teeth, right? So with that, just that little tidbit, that fact, we've got listeners that we're educating across the air. So how do we now, let's move to the future. So we talked about Juneteenth past and present. So how do we now get this education, and how do you see Juneteenth impacting our future?
I think it's the opportunity for us to have a day of teaching. I've always been conflicted with Martin Luther King Day of Service without having a teaching element to it. I've been involved with Martin Luther King Day celebrations for many years, and I love him. He's a dear brother of Alpha Psi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated, which I'm a member of, but I have the question of what else? How do we not only continue these holidays, these celebrations, but have the education element? This is a time for us to actually have a platform. On this day, we should have functions where the historic sites where enslavement occurred, have those places open. And if they cost something that day make them free. Open the doors to these museums that cost money so people can come in and learn. I understand that, schools K through 12 are out of session at that time, but that doesn't mean that our local community centers and libraries can't have programs just to teach. Yep. Enslavement is much bigger than people thought. We know that the largest slave port in America was in South Carolina. Well, the second largest slave port that, nobody really talks about it is New York City. Really? People aren't really, they're not told these things. Nobody is told the history of enslaved people having two ways to go on Underground Railroad. It wasn't just north. African Americans were escaping into Mexico, which caused problems with Mexico and the United States, and the enslavers were going back to Mexico to try to get the enslaved people back, but they weren't. The Mexicans embraced the African Americans, and we were given automatic amnesty if we were able to get into Mexico. So these things need to be taught. It's great that we have a Harriet Tubman, but who was the conductor on the railroad that went south? We have to have more education. We can't just stick to the basics of the I Have a Dream speech. We can't just stick with Frederick Douglass. We have to do more to educate our children. If we're not willing to do that, we are part of the problem, not the solution.
Wow. Education is the key. And I believe that once a person understands what is, you let them make the decision, right? Don't sugarcoat it. This is what happened. And then allow them to go through the process. Because listen, God made us all a phenomenal brain, right? He gave us all the ability to comprehend, to think, and to understand, and emotions and feelings. And when you give it to us straight, I believe that every human being will have an opportunity to process it and ultimately see the truth in it all. Listen, our closing moments, I want you to talk about, we had a discussion about food and how important it is to our history. Tell us a little bit about what you're working on and what you're getting ready to work on in the future as it relates to food and history.
So right now, I'm working on a project called Black Folk and Our Food. It's an oral history project. It's funded through NEH and Oral History Association. And what I'm doing is going into the homes of individuals, and I'm conducting an oral history while they're actually preparing an unwritten recipe that's been passed down within their family. The goal of the project is to capture enough of these recipes from African Americans that were unwritten and create a digital cookbook. So not only are you continuing to preserve this tradition in cooking, you're preserving the history and storytelling and memory keeping. And not only that, but it gives the gift to these families that in decades to come, you Google your family name and you get the voice of your ancestor while they're preparing a dish from one of your other ancestors to make sure that you are fully capable of owning your narrative.
Awesome.
And that's the purpose of Black Folk and Our Food.
Well, listen, I'm looking forward to that project. And Brother Taylor, it was phenomenal having you on Stay in the Water. But this won't be the last time. So we want to thank all of you for tuning in once again for Commonwealth Conversation Series Juneteenth. But guess what? You can join us every Sunday at 1 p.m. as we broadcast live from the campus of the Norfolk State University here on Hot 91, the soul of VA, where we bring movers, shakers, and policymakers to you to discuss issues important to the community. Until next time, God bless.